The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history.
A central figure in that era, a woman named A'Lelia Walker.
A'Lelia opened her own little night spot. She called it the Dark Tower. It was a hangout for artists and those who respected their talents.
Walker's great-granddaughter, A'Lelia Bundles, is showcasing that era in a new book. Not the first time Bundles has shared her family's ties to African American culture and business. Bundles' biography about her great-great-grandmother, Indianapolis entrepreneur Madam C.J. Walker, served as the inspiration for a Netflix miniseries starring Academy Award winner Octavia Spencer.
Sisters, let's talk about hair. They put us down, tell us we're ugly, make us feel ugly. Wonderful hair leads to wonderful opportunity.
Get to know author, journalist, historian A'Lelia Bundles, her life growing up in Indianapolis, why she values historic preservation, and the challenges and successes she's faced in her career. On this edition of the Business and Beyond podcast, presented by PNC. This week on the podcast, I am honored to welcome A'Lelia Bundles. She is an award-winning journalist, historian, author of the highly anticipated biography, Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, that is due out in early June, I think June 10. A'Lelia is the great-granddaughter of A'Lelia Walker and the great-great-granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker. Of course, the pioneering entrepreneur and philanthropist who built a beauty empire in the early 20th century, such an important part of Indianapolis history as well. Her latest book is the first major biography of A'Lelia Walker, who was a fearless icon of the Harlem Renaissance, turned her life into a work of art, and whose story has long deserved the spotlight that it is now getting. A'Lelia Bundles, also the author of the best-selling On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, which, of course, was adapted into the Netflix series Self-Made. A'Lelia Bundles, you are a busy woman and have been for a long time. It is really great for you to take a few minutes to chat.
Gary, it's always good to see you, and it has been too long.
I agree. Let's hop right into it. Your latest work, what inspired you to write Joy Goddess, and what makes the A'Lelia Walker story so timely, maybe in this day and age in 2025?
Well, she's my namesake, and and actually, it's hard for people to believe, but I was more fascinated by A'Lelia Walker than Madam Walker when I was a young person. In high school, I wrote a report about A'Lelia Walker, senior year at North Central, the spring of 1970, because she had known the artists and writers of the Harlem Renaissance, and I was beginning to discover some of those people like Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes. So I was fascinated by her story, but obviously Madam Walker is kind of the more substantial story, and I needed to write that book first. But while I was writing On Her Own Ground, I really began to realize that A'Lelia Walker needed her own story. And we're now at the centennial of the Harlem Renaissance, an interesting, amazing time of flowering of culture, music, art, and I think we're in another Renaissance at the moment.
Yeah. Anything surprising or moving to you that you discovered while researching your great-grandmother's life?
You know, she has really in some ways been kind of caricatured, and really overshadowed by her mother. And that they had a, very complicated mother-daughter relationship. I try to explore that. But in the 1920s, after Madam Walker died, A'Lelia Walker really came into her own. She had inherited her mother's homes and her business, and she loved music just as her mother did. And really, her homes became the centerpiece for a lot of the best parties of the 1920s, where artists and writers and musicians and actors gathered, and they met African American socialites and African diplomats and European royals. So it was a very unusual and a very exciting scene that she created.
Talk about that and how she influenced the Harlem Renaissance, not just as you say, as a hostess, but really, maybe as a cultural force.
I guess she would be what we would now call an influencer.
Yeah, right.
I've sort of decided that I'm calling her a social impresario. One of her friends said that when she had a party, she would call someone up and say, "Darling, I'm having a party tomorrow night, and it just wouldn't be complete without you." Absolutely not. So she had that ability to convene and to bring people together.
Any myths, misconceptions about A'Lelia Walker that you connected with the biography?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of people who love the Harlem Renaissance. It's such an exciting era. But really, until recent times, the women of the Harlem Renaissance have been really kind of overshadowed. And there's one, really well-known book about the Harlem Renaissance where the author, who's a really great scholar, but he concluded that A'Lelia Walker spent the entire 1920s playing bridge. So she did enjoy bridge and she enjoyed a good poker game, but she was doing a lot more than that. And so I really try to tell that story. And and I will say for those who saw Self-Made, which was, as we can only say, loosely inspired by my book On Her Own Ground, the character in the series is like 180 degrees different from the real person. So I'm really eager for people to see this charismatic woman who had such an impact on the environment in Harlem.
It sounded like she was a real character.
Absolutely. She was tall. There was another person who said she didn't just walk into a room, she swept into a room. She wore turbans and she had diamonds and she had a very gregarious personality.
You've now written major biographies on both your great grandmother and great great grandmother, Madam C.J. Walker. Any connections or correlations, or do their lives speak to each other at all?
They are a very interesting mother-daughter combination. Obviously, Madam Walker is that generation, that first generation entrepreneur driven, hard charging, with great expectations for her child. And we see it all the time. It is very hard for an icon's child to live up to those expectations. And sometimes people do it well. Sometimes they're really overshadowed. Sometimes they carve their own path. And I think in the book, what I tried to do was to show the complexity of that relationship. Violet Reynolds, who was Madam Walker's secretary. So there are some people who remember Violet Reynolds because she worked at the Walker Company until the 1970s when she was
Wow.
well into her 80s. When I asked her, I said, what was their relationship like? And she said, fire and ice. Then
Mm.
she said it again, fire and ice. They loved each other dearly and they sometimes fought fiercely. And
Hmm.
I can see that in some of their letters. But what I do understand is that they grew up, they lived in poverty for a very long time. A'Lelia Walker was already a teenager by the time her mother began to develop her business, but they bonded over music and culture. Even when Madam Walker was a poor washerwoman, Sarah Breedlove in St. Louis, she had a good enough voice to be in the choir at St. Paul AME Church. Her brothers were barbers in St. Louis at a time when Black men dominated the barbering trade. Musicians gathered in barbershops. And for a time, they lived across the street from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played. So,
Wow.
this sort of early exposure to music finds its way into their lives later when they're in New York and when they're wealthy. They are going to the opera, they are hosting parties. In fact, one of their parties in Indianapolis in 1914 was Noble Sissle. Noble Sissle from Indianapolis was the featured entertainer, and that's before he really became nationally known. So they loved identifying young talent.
Fascinating. Speaking of Madam C.J. Walker, as mentioned, you authored the best-selling On Her Own Ground, which was adapted into the Netflix series Self-Made. What was that experience like? That must have been something.
It was it was both highs and lows.
Oh, really?
So Octavia Spencer was great. I mean, I every time she came on screen, I thought she really embodied Madam Walker. But I had, what one would call creative differences with the showrunners and the writers because I was hoping for something along the lines of Hidden Figures.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
feel
Hmm.
like they kind of made these Hollywood tropes into something closer to Real Housewives of Atlanta at
Mm,
times.
yeah.
So Madam Walker and she did have a competitor, Annie Malone, and they were definitely competitors, but both were really, strong, accomplished women. And instead of letting that flower in the script, they decided they were just going to have a cat fight between two women. But for me, that's such a cliche. And
Yeah.
there were so many other stories to tell. So I'm happy to say that we are already envisioning what we're going to be able to do with Joy Goddess. Nothing signed, but vision is happening.
So we may see something similar out to maybe for distribution.
I hope so. I hope so.
Very good. Stay tuned for that. That's a tease, as you know,
That's a
from
tease.
your experience in the television business. As you look, one more on Madam C.J. Walker, because her story is so fascinating on many levels and important here in Indianapolis as well. But as you look at her entrepreneurial spirit, how do you see it reflected today, maybe in the broader African-American entrepreneurial community? Do you see that what she accomplished in her life, the great things that she did, and how that is maybe reflected today in modern society?
Definitely. I'm so, I guess, encouraged, heartened, gratified, grateful that so many people do see Madam Walker as inspiration, people who are entrepreneurs or people who are CEOs of companies. I mean, I see that all the time. So that makes me feel good that this story is known. I mean, I do think, honestly, we are in a period of time where so much of this progress that has been made on the entrepreneurial front, on the education front, those things are being threatened. And I think I just really don't understand, why there would be any desire to not want to see other people succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But even some of the venture capital funds that have been designated for Black women for small amounts of money, that's been challenged when only less than 1% of venture capital funds go to women of color. So I would just like to see, more enthusiasm for everybody being able to succeed.
Yeah. What do you see as the hurdles or what's preventing that from happening? Any personal perspective?
Yeah, listen, I think that when the playing field is level, that people succeed. I mean, there are all kinds of people in the last few decades who've built really successful businesses, and lots of people aspire to. I think there is some discomfort with seeing that, and there's been a backlash to seeing people succeed. And, and I don't know how else to say this, but there are just some people who really don't want to see Black women succeed. I mean, that's kind of where we are. But a lot of people do, and a lot of people are supportive.
Yeah. You talk about the legacy of Madam C.J. Walker, and certainly a lot of that history along Indiana Avenue here in Indianapolis in the Madam Walker Theater, which that whole area undergoing a renaissance, if you will. Your thoughts on that, and as you see development and focus and a lot of attention in that area.
It's really good that this part of this city is, undergoing some change, and I think there is, on the part of most people, there is some real thoughtful approach to this. And we know that the neighborhood was really destroyed because of the highways and because the campus came through and eminent domain took away the houses where people were living. We still, fortunately, do have the Walker Theater Center that's there. The newer building is the Urban League. And now Purdue is beginning to develop another part of Indiana Avenue. But I'm really pleased to see that organizations like the Rethink Coalition with Charlie Richardson and Brenda Freege, and that coalition of people are looking at ways to try to make sure that the neighborhood, that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past that just kind of erase the heritage of the neighborhood. So I'm glad to see that. And I know, folks like Evan Hawkins at Purdue are really very sensitive to how the development happens. And I just think that's really, really important.
Talk more about that, your interest in historic preservation and what's happening in Indianapolis. Also, your career in media as well, when the Business and Beyond podcast returns. Stay with us.
At PNC Bank, we're committed to making a difference in the lives of our customers and communities by helping them move forward financially. As a Main Street bank, we try to do right by our customers with every encounter. Our local teams offer personalized financial advice to help guide you in making the best decision. We're proud to be part of your community. PNC Bank. See how we can make a difference for you at pnc.com. Copyright 2022, the PNC Financial Services Group, Inc., all rights reserved.
We build Indiana. The Laborers International Union of North America builds and maintains roads, bridges, and other essential infrastructure that make us the crossroads of America. So thanks to LIUNA members' work, Hoosiers have a better quality of life, like access to utilities, easier routes to jobs, schools, or medical care, and deliveries keep moving. We build Indiana for good jobs and stronger communities. The Laborers International Union of North America. We are LIUNA.
And welcome back to the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. My guest this week, A'Lelia Bundles. She's an award-winning journalist, a historian, author, most recently a biography that is expected out June 10th, Joy Goddess, the A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance story. And a lot of folks will be interested in getting a hold of that when it comes out. A'Lelia, I should mention, you just received, with all the things you are up to, you just received quite an honor from Martin University here in Indianapolis with an honorary degree.
You know, I really love my hometown, and people are so kind to me. I've been gone away from Indianapolis for a long time, but I love the fact that I can just come back and it's like I never left. And so I'm really grateful for that degree, and having the chance to speak with the students about the legacy of Boniface Hardin, and I really lean into why it's important that we know American history, Black history, Indiana history, and family history, because I want people to be able to find the heroes in their family. And and then I sprinkled it on a little bit of life's lessons and advice and some things I've learned along the way. I've been around for a long time, Gary.
We all have. Well, how about in Martin University itself? You mentioned the Reverend Boniface Hardin and the impact that certainly he had, and the impact that Martin has continued to have for a number of years.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so wonderful. It is a small school with a big heart, and offers opportunity to students who might not find themselves in other places. So it really was important to be able to interact with the students, the graduates, and the families. And there's nothing like commencement for families, and to really acknowledge, the aunties and the grandmothers and the moms and dads and the sisters and brothers who all play a part in the success.
You mentioned you were away from Indianapolis for a number of years. You worked as a network news executive at NBC and ABC as well. I think 30 years in television news, which is a long time in any field, especially in the news business. How did your experience as a journalist shape your approach maybe to writing these biographies?
In some ways, I feel as if those 30 years were, just the preparation, the tutorial that I needed to write the books that I do. But I really started writing in elementary school at Grandview Elementary School, which doesn't really even exist anymore. But at West Lane Junior High School, my newspaper advisor, Jim Gasho, was the person who really put the journalism bug. And he was like a tough guy on the outside, but he really cared about us. And we had a junior high school newspaper that won national awards. So he really made me think I was a journalist, and that carried me forward. So working at NBC and ABC for 30 years, about half with each, was a wonderful experience. And, I loved being in the news business. I don't know that I would love being in the news business today.
Yeah.
Because it's really different. But I had great colleagues and great opportunities to do important stories with a lot of really smart people.
As you look at the changes that you see now from the outside, having been on the inside of network news, your thoughts?
It's just so different. With that, I started when it was three networks, ABC, NBC,
Right.
CBS. That's where everybody got their news. I think it's now both the worst of times and the best of times. I mean, there's so much misinformation, intentional disinformation. AI just complicates that even more. For all the good that we all get from AI, there's a lot of mischief making that will happen. And at the same time that the sort of the lies and the misinformation just anger me. I don't know how else to say that. I was going to say annoy me. No, anger me, because I hate it when people lie. But at the same time, there's some incredible investigative journalism going on and a lot of, information. People are writing great stories, writing great books. So it's a combination. It's good and bad and ugly.
Yeah, yeah. And it sounds like you wanted to be a journalist from a very early age.
Absolutely. I mean, I tell you, and this is really funny. When I wrote a story when I was 8, and one of my mother's friends, who was a school teacher working on her master's in the summer, was doing IQ tests of kids in the neighborhood. And she read a little story that I wrote and she sent it to a children's magazine. So, at 8 years old, I thought I was a writer. And when I got to West Lane, our science teacher asked us the first day of school to fill out a 5 by 8 card with our name and parents' phone numbers. And I guess this is in case we acted up. But he also asked us to write our hobbies, and I put writing. And he's the one who said, "Oh, you should go work for the school newspaper." So
Oh,
it was that village. I mean, I had great teachers at West Lane, and it was that village of teachers who really helped plant those seeds for me. So
yeah.
I am grateful for my public school education in Indianapolis.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what you say there, I think, is so relevant, and that's the importance of teachers and how critical they are for so many people. And obviously, that guided you on the path that you ultimately went on, and with your experience there.
It really did. I mean, you look now, and the teachers make such a difference. When I was in graduate school at Columbia in journalism, I had to write a master's paper, and my advisor was a woman named Phyllis Garland. This is 1975. She was the only Black woman on the faculty. That was at that moment when the doors were opening up. And so we met to talk about my paper. I gave her some really cliched topics. At the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker?" And I think she knew the answer because she'd been a longtime journalist at Jet and Ebony. But I said, "Yeah, that's my family," because Gary, I was not really trying to be that. I was like
Yeah,
doing my thing.
sure.
And when I said, "Yes, that's my family," she said, "That's what you're going to write about." So the combination of Mr. Gasho and Mr. Van Sickle in junior high school and Phil Garland when I was in graduate school really gave me a purpose in addition to my career in network television news.
Yeah. Mention how busy you are. You mentioned Columbia University, where you did your graduate work. You served on the board at Columbia, the National Archives, locally here, Gang Gang, which is a tremendous organization doing really cool things, among other organizations. What drives your commitment, really? What your passion for institutions that are kind of connected to history and culture?
They do need to be consistent with with the things that are important to me. And, my parents were my best role models. They were both very engaged in the community. Many people knew my dad, Henry Bundles, who was at Center for Leadership Development. My mom was on the school board in Washington Township, involved in politics. So I saw what they did every day, and that service was very important. And so through the years, you're right, at Columbia, that was about education. I care a lot about education, preservation. I'm on Indiana Landmarks board. Gang Gang is culture. So and National Archives is about, archiving and history. So things that really are a passion for me. Gary, I've never been on a corporate board, and I think it's too late for me to do that. But these are things that I give back to. And I'll tell you just a little story that I shared with the students at Martin University, that in my career, like I have had this great career, but nobody gets through life and career without obstacles.
Mhm.
And sometimes you have a boss who, doesn't like you and you might not like them. And so you're kind of in a holding pattern. And I've had a couple of those times, but when I had that frustration, being involved in my alumni organizations or being involved in a volunteer capacity helped me develop some leadership skills that instead of being frustrated, I was able to develop those leadership skills. And then ultimately, when things eased up in the career, then I was able to apply those. So it is that, I think, combination of, just, opening another door when one seems to close.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about. I do want to hit one more. You mentioned Indiana landmarks, and we talked earlier, Rethink 6570, historic preservation piece in there. As you look at the landscape here in Indianapolis when it comes to historic preservation and the work going on, do you like what you see? Would you like to see things move in a different direction? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think in the more recent decades, there's really been this attitude of let's preserve some of the identity, the physical identity of Indianapolis. So Massachusetts Avenue was kind of like a toe in the water, and then Virginia Avenue, and then the Bottle Works factory, and, sort of trying to preserve the sense of Indianapolis so that it's not just generic. And, I became involved in kind of a protest for a building that was going to go up next to the Walker Building because I just thought it didn't reflect the character. So I'm glad that there was some receptivity to that. So I think as the city is developing that to be able to keep some character and for the things that have been torn down to be able to have some reference to the heritage of the area is very important. Rethinking the patterns of the highway is really important to not destroy more neighborhoods, to really try to connect the neighborhoods together, to think about the people who are impacted.
Your outlook, your view on Indianapolis going forward. Certainly, Indy has changed a lot since my wife and I moved here in 1983, so 40 plus years ago. And I look at downtown and the area around downtown now, and another tipping point where you're looking at the Elanco headquarters and all the development going on the west side of White River. Several $1 billion really changing the face of downtown. What's your outlook for Indianapolis for the next 10 to 20 years?
I think Indianapolis is very fortunate that there are, people both in the political world and business world who have made sure that the downtown did not die. That was critical. Simons, Lillian Dowman, and others, because it could have just been like so many downtowns that are just dead. But it is vibrant. But I do, hope that there's this sense of who are the people who lived in the areas? How do we reflect their culture, even if the buildings are not there? Let's make sure that Indianapolis is a place that, that recognizes the diversity there. I mean, I was on a committee that looked at all of the different ethnic groups in Indianapolis. I mean, obviously, it has changed a lot since I left for college in 1970. It is such a culturally, nationally, internationally diverse community. And to be able to absorb that, it makes us a more interesting place. Gary, I have to tell you, I'm doing something in Martha's Vineyard in July and at a place called Featherstone Center. And the executive director is Ann Smith. Her mother, Francine Kelly, was the former executive director. They're from Indianapolis. And another friend, a mutual friend of ours who's not from Indianapolis, was, saying, I didn't know there were any Black people in Indianapolis. So, obviously,
yeah,
we're there.
Yeah.
So but the identity of the city, it's so vibrant and so diverse. And I love that it can be embraced.
Yep. Okay. Give me a reminder now on the release of Joy Goddess. Going to be really a cool biography. When is it coming out and where can folks get it?
So Joy Goddess, A'Lelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance will be published on June 10th. And I'm doing a tour, and my Indianapolis launch is June 22nd at the Madam Walker Legacy Center, of course, with a reception at 3:30. I think 2:30 we're dedicating the Madam Walker marker, and then 5 to 7 is a book talk with Tamara Winfrey Harris as my conversation partner. So if people go to Madam Walker Legacy Center's website, they can register, and I would love to see them.
And stay tuned, right? Perhaps a docuseries may be coming out of this, right?
I'm working on it every day.
All right. Well, knowing you and your background and your history, you're going to be successful. A'Lelia Bundles, really a treat. You're a fascinating woman. Congratulations on all you have accomplished. And I know you have a lot more to accomplish going forward. So appreciate the time.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're still doing this.
That's right. For the foreseeable future, too. A'Lelia Bundles, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Business and Beyond podcast presented by PNC. It is a weekly conversation with achievers in business, sports, entertainment, and beyond. And you can download all of our episodes, more than 200, and get Indiana business news 24/7. All you have to do is go to InsideIndianaBusiness.com. I'm Gary Dick. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.